So the reason we're all here today, Marc Randolph. So Marc is many things. He's a veteran of Silicon Valley. He's an advisor and mentor to up-and-coming entrepreneurs. He's a serial tech entrepreneur himself, a keynote speaker, and the co-founder and founding CEO of Netflix. And he's also the author of this book, That Will Never Work. Sorry, the sun's a little bit in the way, which I recommend everyone reading. It's all about idea generation to team building to knowing when it's time to let go. And I'm going to share some details of how you can order the book after today's talk. And I'm also really excited to announce and introduce our interviewer for today, Ariel Bogle, who's an award-winning science and tech reporter at the ABC. She's the former technology reporter at The Conversation, and her work's been published all over the place, from the New York Times to Slate, The Atlantic, and the Financial Review. So I'm going to turn off my video now and hand you over to Ariel and Marc. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Marc, too. I think I speak for many of us on the call probably when to express some gratitude to you for founding a service that's helping all of us get through this lockdown in many ways. I wanted to potentially talk to Marc for about 20 minutes and then open up to audience questions. So as Anna said, please put them in the chat. I'm sure you have many, many questions for Marc. So potentially to start with, I mean, Anna mentioned this too, but what is so engaging about the book is the discussion of the ideas process. You talk about brainstorming ideas with Reed Hastings, you know, really just like sort of letting your mind flow and not rejecting any of your ideas. Can you talk about that initial idea generation phase and how you landed on the idea for Netflix?
I'd be happy to, Ariel. And first of all, thank you for having me. And thanks, Anna, for putting this all together. You were remarkably persistent. I think we've been chatting. I was going to use the word pestering. We've been chatting for probably a year and a half now. So I'm glad this finally worked out. But I'm happy to talk about ideas because, one of the reasons that I wrote That Will Never Work was to try and dispel some of these myths about entrepreneurship. And one of the big myths is that ideas somehow spring out of thin air in this epiphany moment, that the entrepreneur dreamer all of a sudden goes, aha, that's it. And then from there, it's a simple walk to the multi-billion-dollar corporation. And of course, that is completely ridiculous. I don't know a single successful company which is now doing the idea that originally sprung up at the beginning. And also, it's a myth that a single person comes up with the idea. Usually, there's lots of DNA involved. Everyone's contributing experiences and backgrounds and thought. And Netflix was no different. That if there was an origin, it was driven by a purpose. And this purpose was not about this passion for movies. This purpose was that Reed Hastings and I were both going to be out of a job in a few months. And that's, maybe some of you now can relate to that. That does tend to be a focusing moment in one's life. But I knew the next step for me was to start another company, because Netflix was actually number 6. Reed Hastings, he wasn't quite in the same boat. He had just sold his startup, and he wanted to go reform academia. But he wanted to keep a hand in. And so we had this deal that he'd be my angel investor. I'd start and run the company, but we needed the idea. And you're right, it was a crazy process. We would commute back and forth to work for months, and Reed would pick me up. I lived in the same town. We'd drive to work together, and we'd brainstorm ideas. And they were, I think, pretty good ideas. Like one of them you may have heard of was personalized shampoo by mail, where you cut off a lock of your hair and you mail it in, and our team of ace hair scientists, whatever that is, formulates a custom blend, and you subscribe to it. But nope. Another one was dog food formulated for your dog, for its breed, its age, its gender, climate, whatever. Nope. And the other crazy idea was video rental by mail, which was just as stupid as the shampoo and the dog food was. And it was one of literally 100 ideas we brainstormed and fundamentally said, who knows? And the only way we're going to find it out is by trying it. And this just could have easily been a conversation today about dog food or shampoo, but just by the way things go, we're talking about video.
Absolutely. So of course, the title of your book is That Will Never Work. And that you do walk through those moments of rejection, how you deal with it, just how to have those first conversations with people when they really do not get what you're trying to propose. How do you stay persistent? I mean, how do you stay upbeat during that phase of starting a business?
Well, it's a fundamental truth of entrepreneurship that you're doing something which by definition has never been done before. And there's a reason it usually hasn't been done before. It's because it's usually a ridiculous idea that most people can see so obviously all the reasons it's going to fail. And they're helpful. And they want to tell you all the reasons your idea is so stupid. And the reason I called the book That Will Never Work is because that is what I heard all the time. You know, when you pitch it, trying to recruit people to come work for you, when you're pitching people to invest, when you're telling your friends what you're up to, when you're telling your wife your brilliant idea, and they all say the same thing, that'll never work. But to a real entrepreneur, that's like waving the red flag in front of the bull, that you feel compelled to prove, no, I am going to figure out a way to make this work. I know there's a way to make this work. It's a puzzle. It doesn't seem solvable, but I'm going to find a way. And I'm not saying it's not discouraging. A lot of times you get really close only to have something pulled away at the last minute because someone didn't believe. But that's part of the game and part of the fun when you finally do, against all odds, manage to prove that, it did work.
Absolutely. So one thing you talk about in the book as well is your focus on data. You know, at the very beginning, these are data points you want for your business, like just information about who directed what movie, what kind of movies wins awards. And now today, of course, Netflix has grown from those early days into a really extraordinary data company with its personalized recommendations and all that type of thing. But that's really in the DNA of the company as you describe it. Can you walk through that focus on data? Because I think at the beginning, potentially in the 90s, people might not have understood fully why you were so focused on that.
Yeah, and you know, companies' cultures spring from the DNA of their founders. And, you know, I was 37 years old when I started Netflix. And as I mentioned, it was my 6th company. But most of my career, the first 15, 20 years, I was a direct marketing person. And I'm not sure what it's called in Australia, but junk mail, catalogs, mail order, magazine circulation. And direct marketing is this exercise where you're mailing things out or doing ads, but then measuring extremely carefully what happened. It is art paired with data. My whole life has been measuring everything I did. And in fact, one of the reasons when we were brainstorming ideas that I was focused on some common themes, which was selling something on the internet with personalization, is because I had spent all this time doing that using these blunt instruments like paper and catalogs and telemarketing. And I saw on the internet this chance to do it in a much more powerful way. So some of the data affinity came from that. The other piece is that Reed was a mathematician. He was a math teacher. He was a computer scientist. He had this unwavering faith in that data and logic would lead to the right outcomes. And when you paired the two of us together, it was only natural. We would build something where it was not good enough to say, I think this is going to be great. We'd also build in, how are we going to know if it's great? How are we going to know how great it is and why it was so great? And that was in the company from the very beginning. And that expression just got stronger and stronger and stronger as the tools got better and better and better.
Absolutely. So, excuse me, tell me, what is the Canada principle? You talk about this in the book.
One of the natures of a startup is there are 1,000 things that are broken. Everything you're doing is overwhelming. You have 100 things to do and you have a handful of people to do them with. And so one of the key things you realize early on is I have to focus. I have to pick the 2 or 3 most important things and blind myself to everything else. And we called that the Canada principle. And the genesis of that is that from very early on, because the company, you never saw this in Australia, but for the first 10 years, Netflix was a company which mailed DVDs to people. It was video rental by mail. And so, of course, people were saying, why don't you just expand into Canada, joining the United States? We said, it's easy. It's an immediate 10% bump in the market because Canada is about 1/10 the size of the United States. And we'd say, well, maybe, but I don't think it's quite as easy as you think. There's a different currency. There's a different language spoken. They have different tastes. They have different laws. And all of a sudden you realize that all these things that seem easy are complicated. And more importantly, that the time you spend solving those little edge cases, if you focused that same energy on your core business, you'd get a way bigger than a 10% return. And it requires great discipline because you see competitors springing up in Canada and you want to go in and get there before they do. And you have to say, no, we're going to focus on what's important now. And that's the Canada principle. And quite frankly, again, that's baked into the DNA at Netflix. And I think it really is one of the secret weapons. I mean, you look at what's happening in the streaming wars and who Netflix is up against. And you have companies like Disney, but who has theme parks and cruise lines. And you have Apple, which is doing cell phones. And you have Amazon, which is managing distribution and cloud services. And Netflix, one thing only. And it's a very, very powerful competitive tool.
I think people in Australia might remember the DVD mailing Netflix competitor here was called QuickFlix. I don't know if you're ever aware of them.
Yep.
But with the Canada principle, so simplicity, focus, when do you know it's time to take on Canada? You know, when do you know that you have the team and the resources in place to start expanding?
Yeah, it's a subtlety. There's no rule of thumb. But pretty soon you begin to realize that there's way more commonality than there is difference. For example, you're no longer figuring out the basics anymore. You're no longer figuring out what's the ideal mailing envelope, just to pick one, which went through 100 iterations. And so you want to get it right in one market. And then you want to figure out how to optimize inventory. Then you want to figure out X, and pretty soon you begin to realize, I've got most of that figured out. Now, okay, I think the next big problem is, in fact, how do we do this in Canada? How do we do this in the UK? And I think those are the only 2 markets that we took that into. But the same thing, even streaming. You know, we started streaming in 2007, but we didn't start streaming internationally, you know, until 2015 or 14. So it takes a while. You want to focus and get it right in one place first.
Yeah, I can imagine that's hard. It is really hard to stay focused when you see all those competitors sort of inching in on your turf. And I want to remind people too to put questions in the chat so I can ask them very shortly. But I want to ask something a bit big picture, because there's some really nice parts of the book where you talk about the internet and what it was like starting an internet business in the 90s. And there's a quote you said, "We were on the edge of an open field, unplowed, unplanted. We felt like pioneers on the eve of a great expedition. There was land enough for everyone." So what was it like to start an internet business in the 1990s, you know, that cusp? And what would it seem like today? You know, just interested in the differences between those couple of decades.
That's an interesting thing, because of course, there's pros and cons. What was wonderful about 1996, which was when I lost this job and I was saying, what am I going to do? It was very early on in the internet age. the internet was just getting to the point where people realized, wow, this might be a real thing, but they were still experimenting what to do with it. And there was this company called Amazon, which you probably have heard of. And they were a book company only. They only sold books. And it was amazing to people that you could actually have a bookstore on the internet. And we could see how powerful this was. But that was the only category. And everyone's eyes opened up in this feeling that you could sell anything. And everything was available. There was no competitors anywhere. And it was a scary prospect of being able to pick almost anything you wanted. And that was a tremendously exciting time. And people were realizing all the things you could do could be done better than their analog parallels. So it was great. Now, the bad part is that I'm not sure what the Australian analog is, but in the United States, yes, there's this great feeling of unexplored land. But what you were exploring it with was 4 horses and a wagon, and your provisions in barrels in the back. And we were in the same boat, which is that the tools were pretty primitive. If you wanted to build an e-commerce website, like the Netflix website, you didn't go up to the cloud and just get an instance dialed up, and you didn't get Squarespace and have a website in a few minutes, or Shopify. For your payment portal, you couldn't get PayPal, you couldn't get security, you couldn't get redundancy. You had to build everything yourself. So the simple little e-commerce website in 1997-98 took us 6 months and about 12 people and about $1 million to build. Now, of course, those things are trivial. Those things are all available. And what that's done, which has been amazing, is greatly shorten the distance between idea and implementation. Then we have this idea, let's do video rental by mail. Well, 6 months later, we're trying it. Now you could have an idea, and 60 minutes later, you could be trying it, which has freed things up tremendously. Then you had to have a track record for someone to give you $2 million to experiment with. Now you could be 14 years old and try something. So in one way, hugely liberating now. Now the downside, of course, is you're getting close to the proverbial 10,000 monkeys and the 10,000 typewriters, is that any idea you think of, someone's tried it, and someone is trying it, and someone will try it, which means you have to be on your game for execution. You've got to be nimble. And the skill these days is not how good you are at coming up with an idea. It's how creative and clever you can be about finding a cheap, simple, fast, and easy way to test it.
It's interesting you mentioned Amazon there, going from that DNA of just selling books to now doing, I don't know what Amazon doesn't do at this point, but you relate in the book that Amazon actually offered to buy Netflix towards the beginning for about $12 million. And what gave you and Reed the confidence and the belief in your project to decline it at that point?
Ignorance. No, more seriously, though, this was very early. This was 2 to 3 months after launch. This was the summer of 1998, and we had just launched in April. And we thought we were there. We had spent 6 months building this website. We had found a way to get every single DVD available. We had managed to get these deals with the DVD manufacturers to put coupons in their boxes. We had solved these brutally hard problems. Now it was just time for the money to come rolling in. And at the time, Amazon just doing books, and we knew just a matter of time before they were going to be into music and movies. So when we got the call from Jeff Bezos saying, come up and visit us, we knew that this was about him perhaps speeding his entry into video. And we went up, and on one hand, an amazing trip, because Amazon was in this nondescript, dangerous, dirty part of town in an old warehouse crammed full of desks and empty pizza boxes and dogs. And we were going, this is the pioneer of e-commerce, in this hovel. But nonetheless, they said, they indicated they'd be willing to buy us. But it was interesting because Reed and I, on one hand, were hugely validated. Because remember, this was the idea that everyone said that'll never work. And here was Jeff Bezos, the pioneer, telling us he saw something in us. But on the other hand, we had just gotten the engine to turn over in our vehicle. And we weren't quite ready to give the keys to someone else to drive. And so it was less really an exercise in selling the company than it was kind of commitment ceremony, where Reed and I kind of looked each other in the eyes and said, okay, we're going to do this now, aren't we?
Very good. So I'm going to ask some questions from the chat. Sandeep asks that entrepreneurs often fall in love with their own ideas. When is it time to let go in case an idea doesn't work?
Oh my God, you should let go of your idea about one split second after you realize you've fallen in love with it. Falling in love with your idea is the most dangerous thing you can possibly do. And don't get me wrong, it is natural to fall in love with your idea. It's your baby. It's ugly, but you've got to see it as the most beautiful kid who's going to grow up to be the footy champion or win the Nobel Prize. But just as likely, this thing's going to grow up doing crack behind the salvos or something like that. So you've got to realize it's flawed, and you've got to test it immediately. And the problem with being in love with your idea is you keep it in your head. You've got to recognize clear-eyed, your problem is bad, it's wrong, it's flawed. Your job is to figure out why. And the longer you keep believing in that thing is beautiful, the longer you persist down a dead end. I'm not saying give up. Never stop falling in love with the problem. Just don't be wed to the single idea.
Great. So Daniel's asking about Netflix. It's very well known for HR and recruitment. And what are you looking for when you're hiring? I think it's interesting in the book too, you talk a lot about your team. You give a lot of credit and time to all those core people at the beginning. So yeah, what do you look for in team members, and what skills and personalities are you hoping for?
There's a lot of aspects that kind of, I think, make the Netflix culture special, but probably the most famous one is that we've figured out how to preserve a core principle of being a startup. I described a few moments ago how you only have a handful of people to solve the work of 100 people. And to do that requires that you let go of this command and control BS. That you can't say, okay, Ariel, I want you to go and then do this. And if you see this, then go this way and check in with me. You don't have time for that. You just got to say, see that mountain over there? I'll meet you there in 2 weeks. And I expect you to have all this stuff done. And I trust you that you're going to figure all those things out. You're going to bump into problems. You're going to work your way around it. But in 2 weeks, you're going to show up. And that's a very rare skill. And the problem is as companies get bigger, someone's late showing up and you go, uh-oh, this isn't good. All right, everyone now check in every 2 or 3 days. Write me a status report. And everyone goes, oh, status reports. And then someone overspends getting to the summit. And you go, oh, okay. From now on, I want you to approve every expense. And pretty soon you've burdened everybody and they hate it. And what you're doing, I'm getting to the point here, is you've built a culture to support people with bad judgment. And you've driven all the people with good judgment away. What Netflix has done is built a culture for people with good judgment. Because fundamentally, what you want when you go to work someplace is not just making a lot of money. It's not the fireman pole and the beanbag chairs and the kombucha on tap and all the BS they have now. You want to be respected and you want to be able to do your job. You want freedom with responsibility. And what we're looking for, long way, so you can tell that I can't answer questions simply and easily. What we're looking for is people who have great judgment and can work independently, make decisions that are right most of the time. That's a really rare thing. So what we're less famous for is our hiring. We're more famous for our firing, is that we don't always get it right. But rather than building a company with guardrails for people who can't work in that atmosphere, we politely let them go, give them a great severance, and build a company of, as best we can, people with the judgment to work independently.
This is also a top-down thing. That I think that Netflix has quite a lot of transparency, even, you know, about people's salaries. Was that there from the beginning, that kind of almost radical transparency to create that kind of culture?
No, it takes a while to begin recognizing what you can strip away. And you can't do everything at once. You have to systematically try things. But the story, in some ways, comes from myself and a woman named Patty McCord, who actually wrote really the culture maven at Netflix. But her and I worked together at a previous company. And it was a classical Silicon Valley software company with a huge, beautiful building with squash courts and beautiful cafeteria with 18 different cuisines and tennis courts and swimming pool and a hot tub, you know, a spa. And we were coming back from lunch and saw some of the engineers we knew in the hot tub. And we stopped by to say hello. As we get closer, they're complaining about the company. And we said, what is wrong with this picture? That these people are in this beautiful campus in the hot tub complaining. But we laughed, but it made us think, what do you give people to make them want to come to work? And it's freeing them. I'm sorry how carefully be my language. It frees them from all the bullshit. That's the most important thing you can do. And so we began this experiment of what can you strip away? And like, for example, you may know about the Netflix vacation policy. You know, there isn't one. You know about the Netflix expense policy? There isn't one. You know, but there's none of these policies. The policy is the same for everything, which is use your best judgment. And surprise, surprise, people love that. But it took us a long time because the lawyers go, you can't not do that. And we go, let's try it. And if it really doesn't work, we'll back up. But then you try it and all of a sudden, no, people don't sue you. No, people don't. They love the fact they're being treated with respect.
So another question from the chat, this is looking at, I guess, the business today. With increased competition to Netflix from Hulu, Apple, Stan, Disney, Amazon, all the rest, how do you think that Netflix can continue to differentiate itself? I mean, it's interesting, just to combine this with another question. The music industry has also, of course, embraced streaming, but there the platforms really compete more on price and service, whereas all these streaming visual content platforms are competing more on content, you know, originals and IP. Do you have a view of those two sort of channels that these content industries are splitting off?
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. And I'm not sure whether it was to the nature of the medium or the nature of how those industries evolve. They certainly are different. And for example, don't think I know any original songs by Spotify. You know, that largely they're an aggregator and they never really cracked the code of how to do their own music. Maybe it's for lack of trying, or maybe it's just a different model. But the interesting thing I think about what's happening in streaming is that I don't necessarily see it as one winner. I think what we're seeing here is that the category has won. Again, Netflix started in 2007, you know, so we have been laboring in the wilderness for 13 years. And all of a sudden in the last year or so, it's become obvious that we were right, that this is the future of television. And it's not like it's a one size fits all, that we all are going to subscribe to a single service. And then if you subscribe to Disney, we've lost you at Netflix, or vice versa. There's room for a lot. There's 250 different streaming services. And this gives consumers the ability to pick, to mix and match. Netflix does have a pretty commanding head start in terms of the size of the subscriber base, gives them a pretty huge economic engine to drive content. And then content drives subscription and subscription drives content. It's a virtuous cycle. But we never for a minute rest on our laurels and think that cements it in forever. It's a very dynamic thing. But I don't think they're worried about one particular streaming service. I think all of us are competing for everyone else's time.
Absolutely. I mean, we talked a bit before about that data data from the beginning. You knew how important that would be. And of course, today, Netflix is really famous for its algorithm and its personalization. Could you see at the beginning that there would be, that it would be important to help people discover content? And were you also concerned at any point that, there's always this debate about whether these algorithms that recommend content also narrow what you're exposed to?
At the beginning, when everyone was telling me that'll never work, my wife, etc., they always had there was two reasons that everyone gave, one or the other. The first one was Blockbuster. There is one on every single corner. Now, why am I going to rent DVDs by the mail when I could walk down the street and rent one there? But the other reason they gave was they go, DVDs are a digital medium. They're going to stream these. They're going to download these. And it's going to happen in a couple of weeks. And so why is your business going to survive? DVDs are dead. And we knew they were right, but we knew they were wrong about the timing, that this might take a lot longer than anyone thought. But what we realized is we could not build a business that was predicated on DVDs, because eventually it was going to go away. And if we'd positioned Netflix as the best place in the world to ship plastic, well, that would go away once streaming or downloading happened. But if we had on day one said it's all about streaming, we'd have zero customers and zero content. So the trick was to find a different positioning, which was delivery agnostic. And our positioning from day one was a place to find stories you love. Because that works in the DVD world. It works in the streaming world. It'll work in the future when we could beam it telepathically into your fillings or wherever that works in 20 years from now. But it meant we had to then deliver on that promise. And at the beginning, it was things like having every DVD available. But here's where it gets to it. Then it became, how do I help you find content? And it meant we spent every waking moment thinking of better ways to do that, including the technology to help predict what you might like. And I'll stick my foot right into it. I don't believe it's a narrowing feature. There is so much stuff out there. I mean, if you were wading through that sea of content without something to guide you, you genuinely be lost, or worse, you'd have the scenario that we used to all have in the video rental store, where you walk in, you see a sea of aisles, and you go, I don't know what to do, and you gravitate like a lemming over to the new release wall, and you watch, the latest era, what's his name? God, Sandler,
Adam Sandler.
Yeah, Adam Sandler movie. And it's not like it's the best, but I haven't seen it before, and it's the lowest common denominator. That is not what personalization is all about. It's helping you identify things you didn't know you might like and that we've helped you discover. And if Netflix does that right, it's absolutely on the right track.
Great. So another one from the chat, this is from Kevin Garber. He says, if you were to start a new business today, what vertical would you choose to tackle, and where do you see interesting opportunities at the moment?
What was it? What would I tackle?
What vertical, what type of, what?
Oh,
sort of
God,
bucket?
I'm agnostic. I don't care. And it's funny, I almost pick ones that I don't know very well, because I really relish the fact that I don't understand them and that I have to learn them. That said, I did do a startup after Netflix, a big one, and it was an analytics company. So that was perhaps part of something I knew something about, but it ended up being a SaaS company, software as a service company, and I didn't know anything about that. I had never, ever in my entire career in business had to sell something to a real person face-to-face. I had always done it through a web page or a catalog or a piece of mail. And so I had to learn that whole process and all the analytics behind that. So that's what interests me. And now as a mentor, I pick based on how much I like the entrepreneur. And they drag me into categories. I'm doing a robotics startup. I'm doing an AI startup, not as the founder, but as a mentor to the founders. And that's the fun thing about life, is getting someone who's a genius in those categories to bring me along.
Awesome. So I think we've got time for one last question in the chat. Danny asked, when is it time to let go or get off the success magic carpet? But actually in your book, you do talk about this in quite an honest way. I think it's quite rare for entrepreneurs to sort of say why they left a business or be honest about what went through their mind at that point. So yeah, we'd love to hear about that.
It's a great one to end with, I suppose, because, you know, I'm incredibly lucky and fortunate. And I don't mean in the way, you know, saying maybe I'm wealthy or what, any of that stuff. I'm fortunate because early on in my life, I learned two critical things. I learned what I love to do, and I learned what I'm good at. And I was even luckier that those two were the same thing. And there was early stage companies. And that was just lucky. And Netflix, of course, when we started it, was an early stage company. It was struggling. It had no idea what direction to go. It had a bad idea. It took 1.5 years to finally find a business model which made sense. And I loved that. And quite frankly, I was pretty good at it. But then 7 years in, we had our IPO. We had money. We were hiring amazing people. We were growing. We were expanding. And I realized I still loved the company the way you'd love a child. You know, I wanted to fight the battles, but I realized more importantly, I didn't love the types of problems that I was solving. And even more honestly, I wasn't very good at it. And I realized that maybe this wasn't the right place for me. And I decided to leave. And I worked my way out gradually so I wouldn't disrupt the company. I'm still friends with the company. Reed and I are still very good friends. But what I got was the chance to do the things that I love and I'm good at, which is I'm now back to working with early stage companies. I still get to come in and sit around the table with these really smart people solving really complicated puzzles for which there's no apparent solution. And I can't imagine doing something better. And that's how you know when to get off the carpet. You have to do things that make you feel whole, that give you time to have balance in your life. And if you can put together that, do something you do well, do something you love, do something that gives you time to spend the time with your family, or do the hobbies that you like. If you can put that kind of a life together, that's the best luck of all.